listening to an audio article by the Common Constitutionalist. Today's article is entitled, Kennedy's Retirement Sends Leftists into a Depressive State. Justice Anthony Kennedy is retiring from the United States Supreme Court on July 31st, 2018. Gee, you may have heard. If you haven't, you must be living on another planet. It took almost no time for the left to go into meltdown mode. Justice Kennedy personally delivered his resignation letter to the White House on Wednesday afternoon, and by 2:01 p.m., ThinkProgress had already posted a lengthy article bemoaning the fate of the nation. It's almost as if they had pre-written it and were waiting for the announcement. Kind of like writing an obituary before the person croaks. And it was also kind of like an obituary for the progressive left. Sweet music. Reading the ThinkProgress piece entitled, quote, The Horrifying Consequences of Justice Kennedy's Retirement, unquote, is like conservative porn. They begin by rehashing the 2016 presidential election and how it was stolen, when conservatives claim the left still is obsessed with and will likely never fully recover from Trump's drubbing of Hillary. You can take it to the bank. Reading their account is delicious and similar to how I feel when viewing a replay of a football game, when, no matter what happens during the game, I know that my team ultimately prevails. I mean, except for this last Super Bowl. Then they list a few of their biggest worries. First was the sacrosanct right of every American woman to murder her children, otherwise known as Roe v. Wade. They claim that, quote, Kennedy, in other words, was the Supreme Court's firewall against the decision overruling Roe altogether. He was content to water down the right to choose, but not to eliminate it outright. With Kennedy gone, that firewall ceases to exist, unquote. Without Kennedy, those right-wing radicals on the court will be free to strike down a woman's right to choose, to murder. Or at the very least, allow the states to decide for themselves. Oh, the horror. Next up, racial justice, because we know the Constitution doesn't apply to people of color, as it was written by white slave owners. Now, ThinkProgress is no huge fan of Kennedy in this area, as they claim that, quote, he was no liberal hero, unquote. But they contend he is a moderating voice, able to keep racist Chief Justice John Roberts in check. Quote, with Roberts in the driver's seat, the court's approach to race will become the jurisprudential equivalent to #AllLivesMatter, not necessarily white supremacist, but broadly skeptical of meaningful efforts to combat racism, unquote. And we all remember how much the radicals on the left hate #AllLives. Even as the article's author is a whitey white guy. Next up are the newly unearthed LGBTQ rights. ThinkProgress writes that, quote, Kennedy authored nearly every single one of the Supreme Court's major decisions advancing gay rights, unquote, and that, quote, the Supreme Court's progress towards a freer, more inclusive society for the LGBTQ Americans likely halts with Kennedy's retirement, unquote. On gerrymandering, ThinkProgress laments that without Kennedy, quote, any hope that the Supreme Court will end gerrymandering is likely to leave with him, unquote. Now, it's common knowledge that the conservatives on the high court live to kill the incarcerated. ThinkProgress writes that, quote, when Kennedy is gone, the court's new majority is likely to usher in a new renaissance for state-sponsored killings and potentially roll back the limits Kennedy helped put in place, unquote. And finally, there is the overall confidence that the Supreme Court will any more make correct decisions, that is, leftist progressive decisions that bestow special rights on some to the detriment of others. Sadly, I say choking back the laughter, ThinkProgress no longer has confidence in the judiciary as, quote, a president who lost by nearly 3 million votes is now poised to fill a second seat on the Supreme Court with a hardliner similar to Neil Gorsuch, unquote. And this conservative could not be happier. And by the way, if you're an investor, you may want to look into companies that produce antidepressants. We may see a spike. Thank you for listening.